really made this a lot easier for me. But Humphrey Osmond really was a pioneer. He was a British psychiatrist who relocated to Canada, and he heard about this LSD treatment, and he started treating thousands of alcoholics. His initial model, as Michael mentioned, was aversive counter-conditioning, that there was people knew that the delirium tremens could scare people, straight, essentially, that was so scary, I almost died, I want to get sober. So that was his initial model, but he started treating people and he realized that people were having these positive experiences and mystical experiences, and he thought that the experiences were so unique that you couldn't have blinding integrity, and didn't bother with that, and found rates of abstinence that were pretty high, but we don't really know how to interpret this. But this was really interesting, what Michael mentioned, that when you put all of the well-controlled trials together for alcoholism, it was amazing. There was a treatment effect in this meta-analysis, and this is a big number. If you do a phase 3 trial, you need 300-400. So in a way, they did something close to a phase 3 trial and had a treatment effect. So this is very encouraging data for a group of us to go back and to try hallucinogen treatment models for addiction. So back to the definition of Schedule 1, and let's see if the serotonergic hallucinogens really fall into this. So a drug of abuse is addictive. There are various models. So if you give an animal the ability to self-administer any drug of abuse that's reinforcing, it will continue to press for that, either intravenously or intrathecally. So this happens with cocaine, alcohol, tobacco. But if you give a lab animal LSD, it will not continue to self-administer it, or psilocybin. He might put on a tie-dye t-shirt and put on the Grateful Dead and dance around and get lost for several hours, lose his sense of rat self, and then it always comes back. You gotta tell it, it'll come back. And the other model is conditioned place preference, right? That if initially the animal forges back and forth, it gets a hit of something that's rewarding, goes back to this area, and this, you can get every drug of abuse to do this, except psilocybin and LSD do not do this. The nucleus accumbens is a very special part of the brain that's involved with reward, learning, as part of our survival. Every normative reward, like food acquisition, water, sex, nurturing, go through this pathway. Every drug of abuse hijacks this pathway and leads to supraphysiologic dopaminergic activation. And so when you give drugs of abuse to animals and humans, you image them, the nucleus accumbens lights up very dramatically. When you give drugs like psilocybin to individuals, although you get dopaminergic activation and increased signaling, the nucleus accumbens does not light up appreciably. And then epidemiologically, the third generation studies that have been done, when you go out and you look, is there such a thing as LSD dependence or addictive syndrome or psilocybin, it really doesn't exist. And so in all the ways that we measure whether a drug has true addictive liability, these drugs really fail the test to be in Schedule 1. And I'll get back to this in a moment. The drugs, though, that really are interesting in terms of addictive liability, the most addictive drug is tobacco, and alcohol is in the middle. The psychedelic drugs are towards the least addictive, and these really are the NMDA antagonist drugs like ketamine and PCP. They have real addictive liability, but if you factor out the serotonergic hallucinogens, they really are not drugs that produce addictive syndromes. And if you look at drugs that are damaging our society, the most damaging drug of abuse in the world is what? In terms of morbidity, mortality, preventable death, what is it? Alcohol. Alcohol is the number 3 cause of global disability. Tobacco is very close second. So these are drugs that are highly addictive and highly damaging, and they're scheduled. What are they scheduled again? I don't think they made the scheduling system. So that's interesting. All right, now going back here. For a second, if you think of hallucinogen treatment models, there are really several ways to look at it. One is that the drugs have some biological effect that is inducing sobriety. And how might that be? And a really interesting model for that is Ibogaine. Ibogaine treats opiate withdrawal. Now, if you give LSD to someone in opiate withdrawal, what will happen? They will be in opiate withdrawal and they'll be on LSD, right? But it won't help them at all. Ibogaine, very interestingly, at one dose, can get rid of opiate withdrawal. And that really has nothing to do with its mystico-mimetic properties. That must have something to do with signaling at the mu-opiate receptor or some other biologic process. So that's a biological model. And 18-MC is Ibogaine without the psychoactive stuff and the cardiac toxicity. And I'll talk a little bit the history of Ibogaine and NIDA funding. And the other way to think of it is mystico-mimetic experiences and spiritually induced experiences as helpful for addiction. And we have really good models through AA, the Native American Church with peyote, and the ayahuasca-based religions. And with these models, it's really important to talk about what comes next and how you link spiritually induced states from pharmacology with psychosocial treatments, and how to put those two together, because recovery is not a quick one-shot thing. Big experiences may help occasion long-term sobriety, but that's rare and unlikely. You have to have something that contains and continues recovery. That's why AA is so interesting, because it's a ready-made recovery community. The number of people that have used serotonergic hallucinogens is very large. There's tens of millions of individuals that have tried these agents. The prevalence rates have gone down, but the United States had a big dose of consciousness expansion in the 60s. And the story of Ibogaine is interesting. Howard Lotsoff was a heroin addict in Staten Island, and he ended up in the 60s trying Ibogaine as a way to try another drug that he had not been high from. But he had something weird happen to him. His opiate withdrawal symptoms went away. He had a mystical experience, and this led him to long-term sobriety. And he became such an advocate for Ibogaine. NIDA eventually spent some money in the early 90s, several million, to study Ibogaine. But the politics of Ibogaine became quite toxic. And Ibogaine has a dark side to it. It can cause bradyarrhythmias and QT prolongations. And there have been at least 20 deaths associated with Ibogaine. So Ibogaine has sort of fallen off in terms of research. But 18-MC, which is an iboga congener, NIDA now has just committed about $6.5 million to Savant to study it. So NIDA has recognized there's something unique about iboga congeners that could be leveraged to treat addiction. Now, again, addiction, as I mentioned, is a kind of spiritual disorder. Addicts lose sense of meaning and hope and connection. And anyone that treats enough addicted individuals, you have the scenario where at some point the person picks the drug over their kids. And that really always amazes me, that a drug can be so powerful and so compelling that you literally can go down the route of using the drugs over taking care of your kids. And that's really how insidious and terrible addiction can be. And so part of the path to recovery is reconnecting within oneself and in the relational matrix of the world and in one's community and community of meaning. And so we know that spirituality has a protective impact on addiction. We know that spirituality has been described within the addictive field for a long time as having therapeutic force. And so how can we facilitate spiritual growth? And I would say AA and the UDV and the Native American Church are quite similar in this way. It's just that in two of them they prescribe a sacramental hallucinogen, but otherwise they're very similar organizations. And Michael talked about this, as far as we can tell, ethnographically, epidemiologically, the Native American Church has very low rates of addiction. The highest rates of alcoholism are in certain communities within the Native American community. They have very high rates of alcoholism, so it's particularly interesting the Native American Church does not. Now, they prescribe a sacramental hallucinogen and they proscribe the use of drugs and alcohol. And so if they indeed, we need better epidemiologic studies, but if they indeed have these very low rates of addiction, it's important to kind of untangle why and what part the sacramental hallucinogen plays in all of that. We know that individuals that receive peyote, hundreds, thousands of doses over their lifetime, long-term, that there are no adverse medical or psychological effects associated with that. We know that ayahuasca is already being used to treat addicted individuals and their communities where this is happening. Takiwasi is an example of that. And we know as well, similar to the peyote studies, that individuals that use ayahuasca long-term do not have ill health effects. It tends to be the opposite. So back to the montage here, and back to this interesting story up here. So Carl Jung is treating this alcoholic. His name was Roland H. And when you take an alcoholic or a schizophrenic patient and you put them on the psychoanalytic couch for 5 days, what happens per week? How does that methodology work? It doesn't work that well. So you remain psychotic, and it doesn't help your drinking. And we now know that psychoanalysis is not helpful for people who are actively using. So Carl Jung said to this alcoholic, Roland H., that's it, you're done, buddy. I did all I can, and I can't help you. Now, if Carl Jung can't help you and says it's over, you know things are not looking so good. So actually, he told this guy, Roland H., go join this group, the Oxford group. It's this amazing group where people have religious conversions and they get sober. So Roland H. goes and joins the Oxford group, has a religious conversion, and ends up coming to America to proselytize. And Bill Wilson is a stockbroker in New York. He's living in Westchester, and he's hopelessly alcoholic. He in a way, has end-stage alcoholism. He's going to die from his illness. He has a doctor, William Silkworth, who says, there's nothing I can do, but in Towns Hospital in New York, there's a guy, Charlestown, giving belladonna alkaloids as a novel treatment for addiction. And belladonna alkaloids have anti-muscarinic effects and can induce delirium and can induce mystical states. So Bill Wilson undergoes this treatment in 1934, and either having a little bit of DTs or certainly on belladonna alkaloids, he has the white light experience that Michael described. And he says, in utter despair, I cried out, if there be a God, will he show himself? There immediately came to me an illumination of enormous impact and dimension, something which I have tried to describe in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. My release from the alcoholception was immediate. I knew I was a free man. So far so good. Bill W. has a mystical experience. He doesn't want to drink anymore. But what happened when he went to Ohio a couple weeks later? So he goes to Ohio, and there he is at a bar. He's like, oh my God, it's all going to come undone. He freaks out. He goes to the phone booth. He calls the local Oxford group chapter, and they put him in touch with Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob was a physician in recovery, and so they ended up having this very long first AA meeting. And really what sustained Bill Wilson was this. So actually, Roland H. comes to him in the hospital, gives him the varieties of religious experience. He said, this book gave me the realization that most conversion experiences, whatever the variety, do have a common denominator of ego collapse at depth. In the wake of my spiritual experience, there came a vision of a society of alcoholics, each identifying with and transmitting his experience to the next chain style. This concept proved to be the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous. So it really was the connectivity, and we've looked at studies now that look at the therapeutic ingredients of Alcoholics Anonymous, and although spirituality and enhanced spiritual states and even spiritual conversion are important, it's actually the size of your sober network being large and the size of your using network being small that is the greatest predictor of how well you do in this ready-made recovery community. And I think this is important because if we're going to design trials of addicts, I think we need a container, something like AA, which is there and goes along, with this model. And Bill Wilson and Carl Jung communicated. You've heard a lot about mystical experience and transformation, and we've seen this with the Johns Hopkins work, and the work with Catherine McLean is really, really interesting. Personality is supposed to be fixed in your early 20s. Your personality is set through genetics and temperament, and kind of, how extroverted or introverted or open or not is relatively set, except in this trial here, psilocybin, 14 months later, and those that had a higher degree of mystical experiences were much more likely to have enduring changes in the openness domain, so more open to fantasy and interested in aesthetics and feelings. And these people were more open. From a discrete pharmacologic event, they had greater degrees of the dimension of openness 14 months later, which is really remarkable because in psychotherapy, isn't that what we try to do? We try to make people more open to change and experience. It's certainly what we try to do in addiction psychotherapies like motivational interviewing. So to treat addiction, if we induce mystical and spiritual states, if we can increase the domain of openness, how can we leverage that therapeutically to treat addicted individuals? And the important thing is what's in the container. Are we going to use standard addiction psychotherapies, such as motivational interviewing or relapse prevention? And the evidence base for these psychotherapies for addiction has been well established. And so we have a lot of good addiction psychotherapies. But I think because we're also inducing these unusual spiritual states, I think it's important to have some part of the psychotherapy that has some component of this, whether it's mindfulness or whether it's 12-step facilitation. I think that they go well together. And I really love the idea of doing a study of including something like AA, because I think you really need to be in a community of recovery for it to be sustained. I really think that that's vital after treating addicts for a long time. And we're trying to figure out single versus multiple dosing. And again, the data that Michael showed, the effect is worn off after a year or so. And so we really don't know the dosing frequency, and that's important to figure out. But we do know, in terms of dose, this study done by Roland at Hopkins shows that as you increase dose, you reliably increase the intensity of the mystical state. And not only that, in an orderly way, you increase positive attributes related to the drug that's dose dependent. And again, individuals that had 20 or 30 milligrams, almost 100% of them said it was the single or top 5 most significant experience in this dose response study. So, but there is between 20 and 30, the rate of adverse psychological events does go up. So, and Michael's data is interesting that around this dose here, some alcoholics are having almost no experience. So maybe there's something biologically that's different, that their sensitivity to the drug is altered in some way through alcohol's effects, perhaps on glutamate and other compounds. So just 2 more slides. So this is Michael, and actually Rick Straussman restarted the field of hallucinogen research in the early 90s. So he was a real pioneer that got this restarted and really provoked the FDA and NIDA to take a look at this. And Rick was able to get research going at New Mexico, and Michael really is picking up the torch from that. And we have Bill Miller here, who is the founder of motivational interviewing. And I think it was just brilliant for Michael to come up with the idea of psilocybin-assisted motivational interviewing. And so Michael's data is really great, and we've been talking about having a multi-site trial now with alcoholics. But for me, I'm particularly interested in a similar design, but how can we use, at the end of this 12-step facilitation, an entry into AA? And in a way, this is sort of like the reverse of what happened to Bill Wilson. Or I think Bill, it's interesting that AA has sort of changed from this organization that was founded by a guy that had a drug-induced experience, who believed in antidepressants, which there were sort of splinter groups that it got to the point you couldn't be on psychotropic medication and go to AA. You can't be on methadone because it means you're still using. So I wonder what it would be like to go to an AA meeting and say, well, I'm sober, day 14, and they clap for you, that's great. And then you say, and I just did psilocybin, and it was awesome, whoa. And then, so that part. So we're trying to figure out how do you, because it doesn't matter what got you sober, whether it's a near-death experience or psilocybin or whatever. You're here sober now and you don't want to use drugs. And so I think that it would be important to think of this link and optimizing that. And again, to just think of what would be the mechanisms of action. And it could be more than one. Is it the biology of the compound? And if that's the case, what sort of neuroplastic changes or long-term changes at the gene level or otherwise could account, or structural brain changes for effects, one dose, one experience, positive effects months later, and what kind of learning mechanisms are involved, and psychological change mechanisms, and spiritual, religious. And again, I think it's important to look at the social domain. We're social creatures, and social influences can really help us sustain positive changes. So I'm going to stop there and take questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for your talk. You gave a really nice historical overview of the trajectory of psychedelics research in clinical use, and you talked in part about the cultural backlash coming from this idea that a kid somewhere took a psychedelic and which coincided with a schizophrenic or psychotic break. And then you said something like, psychedelics don't cause schizophrenia. I've encountered that sentiment a lot from skeptics of clinical research into psychedelics. And can you say just a little bit more about that?
Well, if you give someone LSD, if someone takes LSD who does not have a family history of psychosis, who's not predisposed to psychosis, acutely within the order of hours or so, it can create a state that within psychiatry we would call psychosis or psychotic-like. If people retain the sense that they're on a drug and they have reality testing that they're altered, then they're not psychotic. If they lose track of time and who they are, they can become psychotic. But that does not endure. The psychosis from the serotonergic hallucinogens does not endure. Only drugs like crystal methamphetamine, PCP, and alcohol can occasion enduring psychosis in people that don't have an underlying diathesis. But people that are prone to schizophrenia, these drugs, like other drugs like cannabis and amphetamines, can induce psychotic states, either first break or relapses. So they're problematic in that population for sure.
So I'm a private capitalist, and I'm most interested in the mechanism of private industry in making these types of interventions more widely available. One of perhaps the most significant criticisms that in private industry we're likely to encounter is that even though we know these aren't necessarily novel treatments, these are novel treatments, and there is insufficient research to support the efficacy of these interventions. And so I'm particularly interested really as a function of business practice, as a function of business model, a tighter integration between the research that's necessary to inform the very clinical practices that private industry provide to patients. Stephen, do you have any thoughts about how best to do that, or
Yeah.
that's my question.
Yeah, it's very hard to do the research, in part, among others, the resource issue. That the studies that I run at NYU Bellevue that are funded by NIDA, you have a real research budget that you have a whole team. When we first started doing this research, because NIH will not yet fund it, we had a very tight budget that really was not powered enough from a resource perspective. And once we had enough resources, it changed everything. Once we had a project manager, we were able to pay our therapists, it powered the study. And the NIH and governmental agencies will not yet fund these studies, so we absolutely need private individuals and private venture philanthropy to get these studies going and to move forward. And we can move so much more quickly, but we're limited by resources. So there needs to be some help from these private entities to kind of power the research.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, Dr. Ross. I'm a medical student at UCSF, but I guess I'm there for the wrong era of empathy research. I was wondering a little bit about, in your cancer study, why you're allowing both psychedelic naive and psychedelic experienced patients, given that could be a confounder, or you think there's not a substantive difference in potential outcome between those groups?
Well, there may be. We don't exclude people. I mean, there are some places where they'll exclude people if they've had more than a certain number of experiences. We decided not to do that. We wanted to see, in a way, this is a pilot study, and I think in future studies, we would want to look at and correlate. Does it matter if someone's had an experience or not? But certainly, if somebody is hallucinogen naive, it decreases some of the expectancy effects. But it's really important. Not only is it important to know if they've had a prior experience, their religious or spiritual frame is vital. And that's why we do an extensive spiritual history. Someone who's an atheist might have a much different experience than someone who's very religious. Although we've had atheists in the trial that have had profound experience. We have one woman, she had an encounter with a transcendental force, which was very important for her therapeutically, but she came back and said, well, I still don't believe in God. I'm still an atheist, but wow, that was pretty powerful. And she developed a kind of spiritual practice based on that. So it will ultimately be interesting to understand one's frame of reference due to pharmacologic agents they've taken or experiences.